The wind clawed across the plains like it had a personal grudge, dragging dust against the ranch house until the windows rattled and the horses screamed in the corral, and inside that house time felt knotted, trapped between a threat and a choice that would poison everything that came after. Because when the rancher said, in a voice so calm it was worse than shouting, "You shave, and I'll kill you," he wasn't bluffing. And everyone in that room knew it, especially her, standing rigid near the wash basin with the straight razor trembling in her hand, the blade catching lantern light like a sliver of judgment. Because this wasn't about grooming or pride or even control anymore. It was about erasing identity, about stripping away the last proof of who someone had been before hunger, debt, and the merciless arithmetic of survival drove them onto this land. And the rancher, Elias Crow, knew that once you let someone erase you, you never fully came back. And that knowledge burned hotter in him than the whiskey he'd poured but hadn't touched. While outside, the foreman watched through a cracked door, weighing loyalty against fear, because Crow had a reputation carved into the county like a gravestone inscription, fair until crossed, merciful until cornered, and then capable of things people spoke about only in half-sentences and lowered voices. She had arrived weeks earlier, under a false name with papers that didn't quite add up, claiming to know horses better than men, which turned out to be true. And from the first day, Crow noticed how she kept her hair long and bound, as if it were armor, as if cutting it would be an admission of defeat. And when the drought worsened, and the bank's man rode, out with threats disguised as smiles, the pressure tightened around the ranch like a noose, and Crow was forced to choose between paying blood or paying pride. And that was when the banker suggested it casually, like discussing whether that appearances mattered, that investors preferred clean lines and obedient labor, and that sometimes a symbolic act kept wolves at bay. And Crow had stared at him across the table and felt something cold and violent wake up inside him, because symbols were just slow violence wearing fancy clothes. And now here they were, the banker gone, the choice returned in uglier form, with the foreman muttering about safety and conformity, and her eyes locked on Crow's, daring him to blink, daring him to prove whether his reputation was hollow. And the rancher stepped forward, boots heavy on the boards, and took the razor from her hand, not with force, but with certainty, lowering it to the basin, saying nothing, because the room already knew what the words would mean. And in that moment, he understood that killing wasn't always about pulling a trigger. It was about deciding who deserved to remain whole and the unthinkable. The thing he did wasn't violence in the way the county expected, but defiance, because he turned, faced the foreman, and said the ranch would stand or fall on its own terms, that no one here would be reshaped to make cowards comfortable. And when the foreman argued, Crow fired him on the spot, knowing it would ripple outward like a stone thrown into deep water, knowing the bank would retaliate, knowing men would whisper that Elias Crow had finally lost his mind. But as the door slammed and the wind rushed in, she exhaled for the first time in minutes, and in that breath something fragile and dangerous was born. Not romance, not trust, but alliance. And the days that followed proved how expensive defiance could be, because cattle went missing, fences burned, and anonymous notes appeared nailed to posts, promising ruin. And when violence finally came, it came hard and fast under a moonless sky, shots cracking the dark, Crow moving like a man already dead, protecting land that had cost him everything except his name. And she fought beside him, hair loose, identity intact. And when dawn came and the attackers lay scattered or fled, the ranch still stood, bloodied but breathing. And the county would later argue about what really happened, whether Crow was a hero or a madman. But no one ever again suggested erasing a person to save a business, because somewhere in the dust and gun smoke a line had been drawn, and crossed and paid for, and the razor rusted quietly in the basin, never used, a small forgotten object that marked the moment when a threat meant to destroy someone, instead exposed the kind of man willing to burn his own future to protect another's humanity. The trouble with drawing a line in the dirt is that the dirt remembers. And after that night, the land itself seemed to watch Elias Crow. The fences leaning like crooked witnesses, the cattle moving restless and skittish as if they sensed the future before the men did, and the woman still using the name she'd given, but no longer bothering to protect it, worked beside him without speaking of gratitude or debt, because both of them understood that survival forged quieter bonds than promises ever could. And the county's silence in the weeks that followed was not peace but preparation, the kind that comes when powerful men are deciding how to make an example without dirtying their own hands. So when the first fire took the south barn just before dawn, Crow wasn't surprised, only tired, watching flames eat through years of labor while the smell of burning hay dragged memories out of him he thought he'd buried with his wife. Memories of standing helpless while others decided what he was allowed to keep. And this time he did not stand still, because he mounted his horse before the embers cooled and rode straight into town, dust streaking his coat like war paint. And the woman followed without asking, because she had learned that the safest place near a storm was close to its center, and in town the doors closed as they passed, the sheriff pretending not to see them, the banker pretending not to know them, until Crow stopped in the middle of the street and said aloud, calmly, that anyone who wanted his land could come take it face to face, that he was done negotiating with shadows. And the audacity of it cracked something open, because fear thrives on silence, and Crow had taken that away. And though no one answered him then, the answer came later in the form of hired men riding in pairs and threes, testing his defenses, pushing boundaries. And every time Crow met them not with mercy but with clarity, driving them off without killing unless forced, because death was a currency he spent carefully, knowing it always demanded interest. And through it all, the woman remained unbroken, her hair a visible defiance that began to take on legend, whispers spreading that Crow protected her because she carried something valuable, gold or papers or secrets. But the truth was uglier and simpler. He protected her because once, when the world demanded he erase someone to survive, he had refused, and refusing had become the only thing keeping him alive. And when the final confrontation came, it was not at the ranch, but at the river crossing where contracts were signed and lives quietly sold. The banker flanked by men who had decided killing Crow would be cheaper than breaking him. And there by the water, Crow learned that threats always return to their source, because the same razor, metaphorically raised against her weeks before, was now aimed at him. The demand this time being his land, his name, his future, and Crow laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. And when guns were drawn and shots echoed off the canyon walls, the unthinkable happened again. Not because Crow killed them all, but because he didn't, because he shot the banker's ledger instead, sending papers into the river like dead leaves, exposing debts and bribes and names that powerful men preferred drowned. And in that chaos, the woman dragged Crow to cover when a bullet caught his side, blood darkening his shirt. And as he lay there watching the river carry away the illusion of control, he understood that violence had never been the point. Identity had. And preserving it came at a cost no ledger could tally. And when the dust settled, the banker was ruined, the hired men gone, the sheriff suddenly brave enough to do his job. And Crow returned to his ranch changed but unbowed, scars earned honestly, reputation transformed from monster to warning. And years later, people would still argue about that razor story, about what Crow had threatened and what he'd done. But the woman, now running the ranch beside him, her hair silvering in the sun, knew the truth, that the deadliest promise he ever made wasn't, "I'll kill you, but I won't let you disappear." And that promise, kept once, reshaped everything that followed. If you like this story, PLs, don't forget to subscribe to Chanel.